What is up, guys? Welcome back to another GeekaWhat video, and today I've got a really highly requested video for you all. I'm going to be building a $600 gaming PC, sort of live step-by-step, bit of time lapses, running through all the components I chose and why, and then later in today's video hooking it up to an Elgato capture card so you can see exactly how this system performs if you'd like to build it yourself. Without any further ado though, make sure to get subscribed if you aren't already. But let's jump into today's video. Now, as with any gaming PC build, we're going to start off with the CPU. For the CPU in this build, I selected the AMD Ryzen 3 2200G. Now, AMD seem to have stopped selling or discontinued the 1200 and 1300X, which were the previous best options to buy, but this Ryzen 3 chip's going to do us great. It's got some really nice onboard graphics that we're not going to be using, but nice to have nevertheless. But more importantly, has 4 cores for compatibility in all the latest AAA titles, and a base clock of 3.5 with a boost of 3.7 GHz. That's pretty decent, and it's also overclockable as well if we want to squeeze a bit more performance out of it. Talking of overclocking, for the motherboard in this build, I selected the MSI B450 Pro M2. Now, this board does support overclocking of both our CPU and of our memory, and is a Micro ATX motherboard, which I think strikes the best kind of price to performance, value to feature set proposition. Now, installing the CPU into the motherboard super easy. Pull up the retention arm here and find the golden triangle on your CPU. Line that up with the triangle on the CPU socket, pop it into place and pull that retention arm down. That really is all there is to it. Now, additionally, this motherboard's got a couple of really nice features that are worth noting. Now, whilst the motherboard does only have 2 RAM DIMM slots, it does also boast an M.2 slot for super fast storage, should you choose to pop that in later down the line, as well as a PCIe Gen 3 slot for our graphics card, which is really important. Now, with our CPU onto our motherboard, the next thing we need to deal with is this, our CPU cooler. In this build, I opted to stick with AMD's Ryzen stock cooler. As far as stock coolers go, it's pretty fantastic. Now, if I had a bit more budget to play with, a Cooler Master Hyper 212 RGB Black Edition would be fantastic and look a treat, but there simply isn't the budget headroom in this build. Now, installing a stock cooler is easy. Grab the included AMD backplate and pop it through the holes in the rear of your motherboard. With that done, simply line the cooler up on top of the holes, and then all you've got to do is screw each of the 4 loud screws down into that motherboard backplate. Now, the final thing we want to deal with while our motherboard is out of our case is this, the memory. Now, I went for the T Force Delta RGB from Teamgroup. Now, James, why did you use RGB memory in a build with a tiny budget? Well, this stuff costs the same pretty much as most of the 16GB kits I'd recommend, and furthermore was the cheapest RGB RAM kit available. I mean, and it looks fantastic, so why wouldn't you want it? Now, I did go for 16 gigs of RAM, which arguably was on the slightly high side for this build, but in terms of performance, I regard it as being much more important than something like a CPU cooler or even some super fast M.2 SSD storage. Now, this kit here is a 3200 MHz kit. Honestly, 3000 is probably enough, but it's going to cost you a tiny bit extra, and it's going to help in some areas of performance. Installing memory is super easy. Pull back the retention clips on one or both sides of your DIMM slot where available, and then line up the notch on the memory with the notch on your motherboard. We then need to simply slide the RAM into place and apply even pressure on both sides. It's going to make a satisfying click sound as so. Don't force it because it will only go in one way. Same for the second DIMM. And bingo, our motherboard assembly is sorted, and it looks so good, I think, with that black memory as well. Really sort of adds to that stealth colour scheme. Now, with our motherboard assembly complete, we want to grab the case, and for that, I need to move my plant. Now, the case that I decided on for this build is one of the latest releases from Cooler Master, and this is actually their Q500L. Now, the bigger brother to the Q300L, the 2 cases are actually the same size. James, the same size, but I thought this was the bigger brother. Well, yeah, it is. Now, basically, Cooler Master have managed to extrapolate some extra space from the initial chassis design by moving the power supply to the front and making way for a full-size ATX motherboard. Whilst I did only opt for an ATX board in this instance, it's a really useful thing to know. And I think this case, design-wise, actually looks a little bit better anyway, and you'll see why in a moment's time. Now, when you first start working with any case, I recommend you unscrew and take off all of the major panels. It's going to make your life so much easier. Oh dear. That actually brings me on to the most clever thing about this chassis. It doesn't really have top or front panels as we know them, instead just magnetic stylized dust filters, which look really cool but ultimately keep airflow really high, but case cost to a minimum. And Cooler Master are passing on those minimum costs to the consumer, making this one of the cheapest cases you can buy, full stop. It also means Cooler Master can do some really cool stuff, like this. Now, they kindly sent me out a few of these with my logo on the front, and I mean, how epic does that look? I had a proper geek out moment when I first saw it. So a massive thank you to their UK and Europe teams who are lovely and kindly sent me some of these custom front panels. Now, the major thing you want to do with any case first off is take this. This is your motherboard's I/O shield. Snapping this in is easy. Find the audio ports and make sure they're at the bottom. And simply apply even pressure to each of the four corners. Give it one last going over, and that is in without any problems whatsoever. The next thing we then need to do is take some of these screws from the included accessory bag and add in any additional standoffs we need before our motherboard is slid into place. Now, getting the right standoffs installed is actually really important, as it stops your motherboard from touching the metal on your case and grounding out and causing issues with static and all sorts of other stuff. Once your standoffs are indeed installed, simply slot the motherboard in and try and use the I/O sort of shield that you've previously installed as a bit of a guideline. You can see I'm having to concentrate here. Now, if you ever are in any doubt with your motherboard and standoffs, it's always best to double check. It's easy to make mistakes, as I've just done here, as you can see. So try and get it right, even if it's second or third time, before you power your system on. Alright then, now that our motherboard is installed, it's time to flip the case all the way around to pop in our hard drive. Now, storage in any build is always going to be a bit of a contentious, subjective issue. I selected a hard drive for this build because you simply cannot afford an SSD as well. You need a hard drive for your mass storage, for your movies, music, games, Steam, Origin libraries, you get the gist. An M.2 drive is a great addition, and something like the ADATA SX8200 Pro or an RGB 2.5-inch drive from Teamgroup is a really nice choice. But in this build, there simply is not the budget, unfortunately. With that being said, installing our hard drive is super easy. We need to take out this sort of holder from the rear of this chassis. And use the included screws to screw the hard drive in from underneath. With our motherboard, RAM, CPU and hard drive all now in place, it's time to install the power supply, which, now I've got to admit, the box is a bit dented because I dropped it down the stairs, which wasn't my brightest idea. But anyway, we shall give it a go. This is Cooler Master's MasterWatt 650. It's an 80+ bronze certified semi-modular unit, meaning you only plug in the cables you need, keeping cable clutter and efficiency to a minimum. Well, efficiency to a maximum, cable clutter to a minimum. Don't worry, don't panic, I'm a professional.
Great banter, it really is.
Now, I was going to say I'm not entirely sure how you install the power supply, but it seems these 4 screws at the front are the trick to releasing the all-important PSU bracket. Now, the final few steps before we put our graphics card in, which is the bit I know many of you are waiting for, is we actually need to put in some of our front panel connectors, so our USB 3, power, reset, and of course headphone and microphone jacks. Now, as annoying as this is going to sound, I'd recommend everyone consults their motherboard manual for this, as it is going to vary on a motherboard by motherboard basis. Now, with most of those cables plugged in and sorted out, we'll resolve the rest in just a second. It's time for our graphics card. Now, I actually opted for the Zotac GTX 1650. Now, it sits below the RTX lineup, so it isn't going to perform like an RTX 2060, for example, and lacks, crucially, ray tracing functionality. But what it lacks in ray tracing, it makes up for in value for money. 1080p gaming on this thing is no problem whatsoever. And this specific Zotac graphics card is super duper small and doesn't require any graphics card power connections either, which makes it really power efficient. Ultimately, you could also pick up something like a 1660 for a little bit more performance, but ultimately budget constraints tied us to this nonetheless fantastic Zotac GPU. Installing our graphics card is super duper easy. You simply need to unscrew the PCIe covers in the way of our graphics card slot, and keep hold of these screws, which we're going to reuse to secure the graphics card nicely into place. Finally, with our PCIe slots out, it's a simple case of lining up that graphics card and pushing it into the slot, and that really is all there is to it. Because this graphics card doesn't require any power, you simply got to screw it in and there's nothing to plug in or worry about on that front. Now, the final component that I want to pop into this system before we look at some live gaming benchmark numbers is going to add a bit of pizzazz. This is from Cooler Master and is one of their new addressable RGB kind of combos. It's 2 fans built into one streamlined unit, which is not only easier to install but far easier to cable manage with fan and RGB cables. What's more, you get an RGB controller included as standard, which means this is going to work in any system you want to throw it in. Now, with all the components secured and nicely into place, all that's left to do is use this SATA cable to plug our hard drive up to our motherboard for data and stuff, and then cable manage some of the other cables. And that's going to be really easy because there really aren't that many. Let's pop those side panels on and jump into the benchmarks, but first a little bit of a glam montage. Enjoy. Right then, so it is the next day, hence the change of outfits. For more of me changing outfits, that's a smooth segue, follow me on Instagram, my personal one, I'll leave it in the description below. Clearly need the gratification of more followers. Anyway, the first game we're going to be looking at today is Forza Horizon 4. I've got the PC we've built here plugged directly into an Elgato 4K 60 Pro, which is letting me capture 1080p 60 FPS gameplay in this instance right from the PC. So you're seeing exactly how the system's going to perform if you decided to build it yourself, and links for everything are still in the description below. They haven't run away, don't worry. Looking at the settings here, it's gone for the automatic high preset. but I have disabled VSync because that's going to hammer our frame rate quite somewhat. And if we go quite somewhat, that didn't make sense. It's going to hammer our frame rate quite a lot. Correct myself there. But looking at the advanced settings, we've got pretty much everything enabled on high, a couple of normal, such as the motion blur, because that's something that's very, very intensive and is going to affect our performance figures. We're going to save these settings and actually jump into a bit of a free play session before running the benchmark mode. Now, throughout all these benchmarks, you are going to see the frame rate up here in the top right-hand corner of your screen, but I urge you not to look at that too much. Sort of enjoy the gameplay experience as a whole, but do take that FPS figure into account. Now, you can see from that top right corner frame rate, we're held steady at 60 FPS, which is what the game is limiting us to, and our GPU is only at about 70% usage. That goes to show that we could crank the settings up even higher and perhaps enable VSync. But personally, I think this experience is spot on so far. Oh. Right, I think we need a bit of a race. Let's go for a race. This, oh no, not a drag race. Cross country, yeah. Oh, bloody Nora. That was not the plan. Now, you'll have to let me know in the comments section below what you think of the gameplay so far. If you've got any questions about this build, hit me up on Twitter as well, as I'm more likely to see the comments over there than on the YouTube comments section. Now, just as the race begins here, I've actually got a question for you all. Let me know in the comments below what build you'd like me to do next, what kind of price point, if there's any particular theme, because it really, really does help me out to get a feel of what you guys are after. Whoa, buddy, what are you doing? I can't help but feel like I've been slightly hard done with me and my Land Rover Defender and everybody else in their super quick Range Rovers, although this is not going terribly so far. So that's why it's called the windmill. That makes sense now. Right, I can't deal with that other view. Doesn't work for me. Dun, 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 dun. Oh, mate, it's like 160 miles an hour. Ooh. Oh my god. Okay, that has not gone quite to plan. Now, I am going to defend my poor racing ability so far on the fact that I usually use a controller, not a keyboard and mouse, but anyway, I know, excuses. Come on, move out the way. There we go, lovely jubbly. I mean, even now that frame rate is nailed at look at the screen, James, not the camera. It's nailed at 60 frames per second, which is really impressive. And that tiny little Zotac graphics card, I mean, it's absolutely mini. It's only at 59-60% usage. And I mean, maybe this thing could even do some 1440p gaming, but I suppose we shall soon see. I think we get the gist now with Forza Horizon 4. It runs really, really well. So let's jump into GTA 5, because I know that's a really popular title. Also, I know I'm asking you to comment a lot of things in today's video, but let me know what games to add to my benchmarking sort of setup in the comments section below. Taking a look at the graphics settings I've gone for in GTA 5, we've got middle of the road on the density, variety and scaling options, as they can be quite intensive, and high settings pretty much across the board everywhere else, with a little bit of normal on ambient occlusion and tessellation, as I see them to be a little bit less important. With that being said, let's now jump into story mode and see how these current settings sort of affect gameplay, how it looks and how it performs. Straight off the bat, I'm actually really, really impressed. The first impressions could not be better. We're hanging around the 50 to 60 frames per second mark, which is where you want to be. And the gameplay, in all honesty, looks super silky smooth. I mean, we're hitting 65, 70 FPS there, which is absolutely fantastic. As someone who games on a lot of really high-end systems, I can't emphasize just how impressed I am. For something that costs $600, I mean, it is just unbelievable. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to take down some of these high settings and pop them down to normal, because I want to see sort of what effect this has on our frame rate and our gaming performance, and if we really get much of a gain out the back of it. So straight off the bat, I want to say that it does feel a little bit smoother. That frame rate is slightly higher. We're hitting 70, 75 FPS, but really you aren't gaining that much in the way of frame rate, and arguably I prefer it previously, where everything visually was just a little bit sharper. Oh dear. What I'm also going to do here as well is run Grand Theft Auto's inbuilt 1080p benchmarking tool. We can see here we're looking 50, 60 frames per second, which is a really great experience. And I know I've said it before, I'll say it again. I can't believe just how good the frame rate and the visual quality is on a machine that costs under $600. I mean, it's completely and utterly nuts. It's also quite reassuring to see that the inbuilt GTA 5 FPS and the Fraps FPS line up, which goes to show that Fraps is indeed really accurate to the single FPS digit when we're doing our testing, which is great to see. Now, I know what many of you at home will be thinking at this point, James, what about a wrath of other titles? CSGO, World of Warcraft, League of Legends, so slightly older, easier to run games, and then newer titles such as Call of Duty's Black Ops 4, or of course Battlefield 5. Well, you'd be happy to know that those older titles I mentioned can see over 100 FPS at 1080p at high and ultra settings, and the newer games can easily see a 60 FPS consistent frame rate if you're prepared to sacrifice a couple of settings and run, of course, at 1080p Full HD. If you've liked the deeper dive that I've done with a couple of games here, let me know in the comments and I'll be able to expand this out to more and more games that you guys want to see, because ultimately that is what it's all about. With that being said though, I think that just about wraps it up for today's video. If you did enjoy it, you know what to do. Smash that like button and get subscribed and ding dong the notification bell so you never miss another bleeding video. As always though, we'll see you in the next GeekaWhat video.